The Kennedys, An American Drama, by Peter Collier and David Horowitz. Only David was free from the ambition and delusion. After his Harlem bust, the committee to keep David out of the picture, which had a 6-month temporary guardianship, had given him the choice of going back to McLean's or enrolling in a drug rehabilitation program in Sacramento, run by a therapist named Don Juhl. Naturally, David says, I chose the latter. Juhl told me that there were 3 rules. I had to jog every day. I wasn't allowed to say fuck off and die anymore, and no drugs. If I broke any of these rules, it would cost me another month, and every month I was there cost me $20,000 of my own money. Nobody in the family came to see him. He lived in a duplex with Juhl and his wife, undergoing what he bitterly called therapy by humiliation, a Synanon-like use of personal attack and innuendo to elicit gut-level response and behavioral change. "What's the matter, David?" Juhl would say when he happened to show up in a long-sleeve shirt on a warm day. "Are you afraid to roll up your sleeves and show us your tracks?" David became increasingly bitter about his family. Always before he had blamed himself, now he began to blame them. "I feel they should have done something earlier. My mother, although in a sense she wasn't really competent, but even more Teddy, Steve Smith, and the rest of the group who were always figuring out ways to keep Joe, Bobby, and Chris from having to pay the piper, but who just let me go. When they finally did do something, it seemed like it was more to keep me from ODing in the street and causing a problem for Teddy's campaign than anything else." On April 15, 1980, the guardianship over David ended, and he began, in his words, to concentrate on having a mental breakdown. He locked himself in his Sacramento room with a black and white TV, avidly watching Teddy's campaign come unraveled, just as he had once watched his father being killed. He rarely ate, living for days on nothing more than a couple of pasteurized cheese slices and a bottle of Pepsi. He began to hallucinate. "I thought I was in the mafia. I thought I was the supreme, ultimate shibumi assassin. I thought I was Lee Harvey Oswald. I thought I killed my father. Then I thought my father was trying to kill me, trying to drown me in the surf of Malibu." When his girlfriend Nancy Narleski visited him, he told her that he felt Teddy had been behind the murder of Al Lowenstein and would kill others if not stopped. During David's coherent moments, he and Narleski staged mock award ceremonies, at which they gave the I'll Never Take Drugs Again award to various members of the Kennedy family who had made that pledge. But there were times when David seemed so sick that Narleski actually feared he would die. On one such occasion, she became frightened enough to call Barbara Kirby, one of his childhood friends at Hyannis, who in turn called Joe and told him that she'd heard David was in serious trouble. Joe called Narleski and yelled, "Don't you call the Kirbys. Everything is under control. There's a lot of things you don't understand. This is the big leagues, so butt out. Just forget that David Kennedy exists." She asked him if he was threatening her. He answered, "You can take what I've said any way you want to," and slammed the phone down. David remained in exile. Desperate for some contact with the past, he called his one-time girlfriend, Pam Kelly, and asked her to come to California to be with him. She agreed to fly out. But then at the end of the conversation he said, "And leave your wheelchair there." And she realized how much trouble he was in. "I can't leave my wheelchair here, David," she replied. "It's part of me, and I'm part of it." David bummed around Sacramento, staying off drugs only by drinking heavily. The family continued to be an almost nefarious presence on the edges of his life. Applying for a construction job, he was asked by the owner if he was willing to go all out and bust your butt. He said he wasn't. He got the job anyhow because Frank Gifford, whose daughter Vicky was engaged to David's brother, Michael, found out about the conversation, called the man, and asked him to hire David. One day he was on the bank of the Sacramento River, drinking wine with his friends and looking at a copy of High Times magazine. There was a picture of his Aunt Rosemary as part of a story on lobotomies. She had a new pair of white shoes on, and she was smiling. The thought crossed my mind that if my grandfather was alive, the same thing could have happened to me that happened to her. She was an embarrassment. I am an embarrassment. She was a hindrance. I am a hindrance. As I looked at this picture, I began to hate my grandfather and all of them for having done the thing they had done to her and for doing the thing they were doing to me. After he got into the news by having his license revoked for drunken driving, the locals discovered who David was. A writer from the Sacramento Bee came to do a profile for the paper's People section. It concluded, "For the most part, Kennedy sits there, nervous, apprehensive, with a perplexed look on his face, and patiently explains over and over again, "I'm pretty much of a regular guy. My life is pretty much like anyone else's, except that I have a famous last name." Asked what his mother would be, an amused smile grows slowly on his face, and he blithely replies, "President." Some of the grandchildren, who had never before stood in the family limelight, now began to talk about possible political careers. For instance, Kathleen, who had spent almost a decade raising two small children with the care and thoroughness she sometimes said she and her cousins hadn't received in their childhood, had run Teddy's 1982 Senate re-election campaign, and afterward tried to interest her brothers in the possibility of moving her family to Maryland and running for Congress there. Her brother David, playing his chosen role as arch cynic of the family, told her she was crazy to think she could carpetbag so easily. "Well," she replied defensively, "Daddy did it." David said, "Are you comparing yourself to Robert F. Kennedy?" David, long since accepted as the most flamboyant of these family tragedies, had come back home from Sacramento on emotional probation within the family early in 1981. In March, he had attended his brother Michael's wedding to Vicky Gifford, startling Chris and others by how sick and unbalanced he looked, and by making such statements as, "I'm a bad person. God is punishing me." That previous Christmas in Aspen, he had overdosed on his mother's sleeping pills, and the others could hardly rouse him when it was time to open the presents. He finally got up and went to the tree, but standing over his gifts, he suddenly became unable to move. Bobby, standing behind him, had said with clinical detachment, "It's weird the way you're standing there. You look like Jesus Christ on the cross." Everyone half expected David to kill himself eventually. That would be the next great Kennedy drama. But somehow, he kept managing to survive one setback after another, drawing strength from the belief that he alone in the family was living without illusions. He got back into Harvard on probation, telling friends that he was taking one course in archaeology. Mummies for dummies, he called it in his self-deprecating way, and another in anthropology, monkeys for junkies. When he managed to pass these probationary efforts, he was allowed to take a full program in 1983. Meanwhile, he was seeing a psychiatrist, and for the first time not using the family's scorn for the examined life to subvert the therapeutic setting. At the beginning, my shrink would ask me about my father, and I'd go on about the pictures on the wall. Finally, we talked it out, and I began to admit where all the hurt in me was coming from. Trying to finish at Harvard, trying to stay off dope, David used his status as pariah as a vantage point from which to view things steadily. My Uncle Jack and my father always used to quote that Englishman, "Politics is the noblest profession." To me, politics is crap. That's the main thing, maybe the only thing I've learned in my life. America needs a rest from the Kennedys and vice versa. When David talked to him in these terms, Bobby would smile and call it junkie talk. David would say, "You're a junkie too. You just haven't admitted it yet." Bobby obscured everything else, especially the fact that his brother David was losing ground in his attempt to find his way into and around the family. David's first reaction to Bobby's arrest had been one of elation. It seemed a belated justice. The due bill he himself had been receiving regularly for years were finally being forwarded to his brother. He also hoped that Bobby's misfortune and the sympathy it engendered would create greater understanding for him as well. But the opposite was true. Bobby's penitence was as spectacular as his failure. Passing his bar exam as a junkie, going 5 months without drugs or liquor, settling down into an aggressively conservative lifestyle. Instead of being company for David, Bobby again showed how different he was. David found himself even more isolated in the family than before. Because his failings had been so flamboyant and so public, he was held obliquely responsible for what had happened to Bobby. He was still the albatross around the family's neck. In the best of times, David was like a person keeping himself from falling by holding onto the edge with his fingertips, a friend says. Now you could see the fingertips begin to slip. He could see that there was no place for him in the family. Someone else would have concluded that he should get away from his family, but David concluded that because there was no place for him there was no place for him anywhere. Nervous and unable to sit still, let alone concentrate, he left his part-time job reading unsolicited manuscripts at the Atlantic and dropped out of Harvard for the second and final time. Since his exile in Sacramento for drug rehabilitation, he had been drinking heavily. He described it as a trade-off, off dope and on to booze. But now he was back on drugs, too. Asked by friends what he was doing, he would say vacantly, Who knows? The family was embarrassed by his needs and bored by his psychodrama. Despairing of helping him, they concentrated on trying to neutralize him. His access to his trust fund was restricted. He told friends that he was being forced to live on $1,500 a month, and that he was living with Paula Sculley, an attractive New York photographer he had met 3 years ago at a family Christmas party in Aspen, in part because she was seen by the family as a controlling influence. Since marriage had helped stabilize his older brother Joe, and to a lesser degree Bobby as well, the family pressured David to marry too. The fact that his family liked Paula made her attractive to him, but at the same time made him wary of her. In his search for escape hatches, David had reestablished his relationship with his old girlfriend, Nancy Narleski, who was still anathema to the Kennedys because of her protest against the way he'd been treated during his stay in Sacramento. He spent hours on the phone with her, often semi-coherent, fantasizing about getting away from the Kennedys and going to live in Hawaii. He was under tremendous pressure from his family, Narleski says. They were terrorizing him. They blamed him for what had happened to Bobby. They told him he had been a bad example. David didn't even bother to point out that it was Bobby who had led him astray. He just accepted their framework and felt guilty. One night his brothers called him a traitor and said that he wasn't worthy to bear the Kennedy name. He was crying when he told me this. Narleski was about to be awarded money from an insurance claim settlement. She saw David's increasing disorientation and desperation, and it reminded her of the time in Sacramento when she had felt he might die. "Just hang on till I get my money," she told him. "Then we'll get away from all this and go to Maui." David helped her plan a getaway, but she suspected that he would probably never be able to leave. He really couldn't conceive of being apart from them, cut off on his own, she says. The Kennedys were his real addiction. During the Easter weekend, the family gathered at Palm Beach, in part because Teddy and his sisters feared that it might be the last holiday for 93-year-old Rose, who was increasingly frail and enfeebled. Some of his cousins didn't come, but David did, returning from a Minneapolis drug rehabilitation program where he had been enrolled under the name David Kilroy. Because there were too many Kennedys for the Palm Beach house, he registered in the nearby Brazilian Court Hotel. During his stay there, he drank constantly, and also managed to find his way to the heart of the local drug scene. On the morning of April 25th, the hotel receptionist got a call from someone identifying herself as Mrs. Kennedy from Boston, who said that David had been scheduled to return home the previous day, but had not been on his plane. The receptionist agreed to check on him. There was a Do Not Disturb sign on his door, but when nobody answered repeated knocks, she poked her head inside. The twin beds were rumpled, and clothing was scattered all over the room. David was lying on the floor, his head propped against a nightstand. As soon as she felt his cold and waxy flesh, she knew he was dead. The evening news showed David's corpse being wheeled out of the hotel in a body bag. The next day's papers devoted as much space to the story as they might have to the death of a head of state. The Kennedys brought David back to Hickory Hill for a memorial mass before burying him next to his grandfather in the family plot at Brookline. If he had been alive, David, who had compensated for his painful vulnerability by armoring himself with irony, might have noted that his entire family was paying him the respect in death that they had not when he was alive and needy. He might have smiled at his Uncle Ted's statement to the press, that he had finally found the peace that he had not been able to find in life, and wondered if there was a hint of relief in those words. He would probably have been amused by all the talk about a Kennedy curse, as if consequences had nothing to do with people and their acts. Those friends who had valued him for the individual he was, rather than for the Kennedy he had tried so hard to become, grieved because of David's effort to become restored to himself, an effort which at times had seemed so close to success. But finally, he had not been able to cut himself loose from his sense of family expectation and destiny, or from the victimhood which had come to seem symbiotically related to the other's survival. Like his family, his friends had all wondered at one time or another if he would kill himself. But when it finally came, his death was nonetheless shocking. Nancy Narleski says, "I keep asking myself why. Why David? Why now? All I can come up with is that maybe his father was looking down from heaven and saw all the hell these people were putting him through and said, 'Come on, you've suffered enough. It's time you were up here with me.'" Although he had been regarded as the Kennedys' neediest case when his difficulties first began, his drug abuse and disorientation soon became a public problem far more than a personal one, an issue with a policy dimension, a matter requiring the practice of damage control in the media. He was, in other words, regarded as a political liability, a potential indictment of family morality. It was for this reason that his close relatives found it so easy to regard him as odd man out and pariah, to make of him the deviation, establishing the rest of them as the norm. Like some of his brothers and cousins, he talked to us at considerable length and with considerable candor during the writing of this book. He was by no means the only one to speak frankly about how growing up Kennedy had led to immense personal difficulties, but he alone was scapegoated for the results. In the fall of 1983, David Riley told us the family pressured him into seeing a prominent Boston attorney to find out if he could retract what he had told us in conversations that had stretched over several months. In the spring of 1984, when excerpts of this book appeared in magazine form, David was bitterly criticized for breaching the family faith. The word used in condemning him was treason, a word with political, even more than personal implications. David was angry at himself for caring so much about their censure, but, as he said in our last conversation with him a few weeks before his death, "They have their own idea of reality, which isn't mine, but it has a hold on me."